Hello there, and welcome to a brand new shiny episode of Sandbox. Brought to you by Bureau Happold, this is the podcast that asks the big questions about the world around us. This month, dear listener, we need to talk about the weather. Shouldn't be too hard, should it? After all, talking about the weather is what Brits like talking about the most, right? Well, this may be true, but it seems like in recent years, the weather has taken even the Brits by surprise. While the UK's 2024 summer may have been a little bit cooler by recent standards, June 2023 was the warmest on record, and in 2022, the UK's highest recorded temperature of 40.3 degrees C was set. Indeed, across the globe in recent years, there have been headline-hogging heatwaves. It's not just the Brits. The weather has taken the whole globe by surprise. But should it have done? Haven't the warning signs been there for years? One of the earliest warnings came from Sir John Houghton, co-chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the 1990s, the same decade that brought us the Kyoto Protocol. What are the alternatives? Can we find salvation solely in technology? Or should we be thinking more holistically? Are our buildings fit for purpose? If not, which is the best, retrofit or new build? And above all, are we too late? Here to answer these questions and a whole lot more besides, I am delighted to introduce this month's panel. They are Bureau Happold's very own Lara Balash and Tom Newby. Lara, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Lara Balash. I'm an associate in the energy consultancy team at Bureau Happold. I'm based in the Leeds office, but I work all over the UK really. So up in Scotland and more locally down in Yorkshire and also down south, down to London as well. My main focus is heat networks and ambient loops, and I do a lot of feasibility studies and master plans around how we can heat and cool buildings at a district and neighbourhood scale.
Laura, it's very nice to have you here. Tom Newby, can you tell us all about yourself, please?
Hi, I'm a director at Bureau Happold. I lead Bureau Happold's structures team. I'm a structural engineer. I also used to work as a humanitarian aid worker, and I've done several years working in a number of countries around the world dealing with consequences of major climate-related disasters as well. So I've got a bit of a different angle on some of these things. Right now, back at Bureau Happold, I work on some major building projects, but also leads large master planning projects, including social housing projects, for example, one in East London, where overheating and the effect of high temperatures and also low temperatures are particularly relevant to how we approach the design.
Tom, it's lovely to have you here, and I look forward to getting that humanitarian angle in today's discussion. And I'm also thrilled to welcome Smith Mordak to the panel. Smith is the Chief Executive of the UK Green Building Council and is leading the organisation through a vital period of getting the country back on track to net zero. With a wealth of experience in leadership roles at architecture and engineering firms and a passionate commitment to building a future economy where people, society and ecology can flourish, Smith writes regularly in the national press. Welcome, Smith. It's lovely to have you here.
Thanks, Andy, and hello, Lara and Tom. Nice to spend the afternoon with you. I also used to work at Bureau Happold. I used to be a director of sustainability at Bureau Happold before joining UKGBC, so it's nice to be with old friends.
Really lovely to have you here, and what an exciting panel we have with loads of expertise there. So, well, panel, shall we get stuck straight in? Since time immemorial, there have been fluctuations in temperatures, heat waves and ice ages. Is this any different? And if so, how have we got here, panel? Smith, I'll go to you first, please.
There have always been lots of different fluctuations. Some of them have resulted in mass extinctions, and I'm not sure that that's really what we want. But I think the key difference with this one is that humans created it, and it's happening at an unprecedented speed. The speed at which the climate and the weather patterns are changing is so quick that it's too quick for natural systems to be able to adapt and keep us all safe. So we have to do a lot more to both mitigate these changes, so prevent things from getting even worse, but also change the way in which our built environment and our natural environment protects us from the worst effects.
Thank you, Smith. And Tom, anything to add to that? How have we got here?
Well, we've got here, and as Smith said, it's caused by humans, by essentially a crazy overconsumption of a lot of the world's resources. And that includes energy, but also physical resources. And we work in the built environment. We use a huge amount of sand, concrete, water, and a belief really historically that we could just keep doing that without understanding the consequences of exceeding the planetary boundaries we live within. And if we don't stick within those planetary boundaries, then the planet can't sustain the life that it currently does sustain, or the societies that we live in. So it's a pretty existential, and these fluctuations in weather that we're seeing recently are one of the early signs that we're reaching a number of tipping points, pushing the Earth's climate beyond the comfortable zone we're used to being in. We really do need to throw the kitchen sink at it in terms of what we as humanity are going to do.
The UK in particular has had the past couple of years of having quite mild and wet summers. So in this local context, we haven't seen the absolute devastation that's been brought across Southern Europe and across the world by huge heat waves over the past couple of years. Globally, temperature rise is happening at an alarming rate. And the past couple of years has been some of the warmest on record. In the UK, we've not seen that recently, but we know it's happening.
Now, every month in this podcast, we like to look at the prescience of our forebears. It seems like there may be some very good ideas in the past. It's just a shame that we never stuck with them. For example, do you remember trees? They were quite useful things, I seem to recall. And once again, I have a feeling there were several things that the Romans have done for us. Panel, what inspiration can we take from the past? Lara, I'll go to you first this time.
In the past, people didn't have the option of having active systems in buildings like we do now. So they didn't have the option of having air conditioning and just whacking a mini split on the side of a building. If you look back at architecture through places like the Middle East and North Africa, you can see the way that they used water, shading, and thermal mass to make sure that they were keeping a comfortable environment inside their buildings. So that might be having a riad type arrangement where you have a courtyard in the middle that might have a water feature in it. So you're benefiting from evaporative cooling from that water feature in the center of a building. You might be using materials like rammed earth and adobe, which have really high levels of thermal mass that can take the heat from the sun and absorb it during the daytime to reduce the peak in your temperature inside, and then release that heat through the nighttime where the temperature outside gets cooler, keeping that temperature inside more stable throughout the day. So there's all kinds of different things that people used in the past. And I think as the temperature is changing and as we're looking at our existing building stock and how, for example, our Victorian terraces in the UK, how they don't react very well to heat waves, it's quite a good exercise to do to look back at how can we adapt our Victorian terraces to be a little bit more like Riyadh in Morocco so that it can weather those heat waves.
In what way doesn't a Victorian terrace handle a heat wave well?
The UK has some of the worst insulated building stock in Europe. So we lose heat from our buildings, and as a result, we also gain heat in heat waves at a much faster rate than a more insulated building would. We also don't typically have a lot of shading on our windows. So we quite often have, in the Victorian terrace example, you have really large windows, so a really high glazing ratio, so lots of solar gains into the space. And you don't have the option of having some kind of external shading to prevent some of those gains coming into the space. There's lots of ways that you can adapt to that. For example, using more ventilation and learning how to use cross ventilation to your advantage. But typically our buildings are really poorly insulated, and we've also got a big problem with solar gains through that glazing as well.
Thank you, Lara. Smith, I'll go to you next. What inspiration can we find from the past? What solutions might be there? What could we have possibly stuck with that we've sort of given up on along the way?
Lara's put it like very beautifully there, but I think the key thing is, in the past, a lot of things weren't options in the way that they are now. But just because we can doesn't mean we should. And yes, it's brilliant that we have all of these fantastic technologies and we can create all of this energy that we can do all sorts of wonderful, fantastic things with. And that's all really, really fantastic. But I think as sort of Tom was saying earlier, we've just decided, well, just because we have all this energy, just because we've worked out ways of taking the kind of millions of years that it took to create those sort of coal and fossil fuel deposits and very quickly convert that into energy that we can do lots of jazzy things with, that doesn't mean that that's a sustainable idea. And I think it's really important to remember the word sustainable means that we can keep doing it. We can't keep doing it. Sure. We will run out of coal eventually, but unless we leave it in the ground as we should. But also it's just not possible to keep doing this and maintain a climate that is habitable for us. A lot of the buildings that we're living in today were not designed for the climate that we're currently already facing. And so it's really not fair for the buildings. We've moved the goalpost. It's not fair to expect a Victorian terrace house that was built, 100 years ago or more now to be withstanding the climate that it's going to have to withstand in 2050, 2100. So we have to change the built environment. You mentioned something about new builds, and even in the UK, in 2050, we will be living in buildings that most of those buildings that we'll be living in already exist, 80%, I think. So we need to retrofit, renovate the buildings that we do have so that it is possible for them to withstand this new climate. Lara is talking about shading, for example. Yes, these buildings very rarely have shading because they weren't designed for that climate that needs shading. But now that we do need that shading, we need to adapt our buildings. We need to retrofit that shading. We need to add that shading. Going back to Tom's point, that's more resources. So now we need to be very careful about the resources that we use to retrofit our buildings. If we want to add more shading, if we want to insulate more buildings, and we absolutely do want to insulate more buildings. And again, I just double down on that point that Lara made. Insulation works both ways. It will keep you cooler as well as keep you warmer. It's really just a great investment. So if we want to do these things, and we do want to do these things because not only do we want to prevent climate change kind of getting even worse because we have to use even more energy to heat our buildings and cool our buildings, but also for the health reasons. We do have people who are really suffering in hot weather and in cold weather. Literally, people are dying already because of this, because of climate change. And so while, yes, we're only seeing the beginnings of this stuff, people are already suffering. So it's already best taking these changes, even if you don't care about climate change, just for people's health and well-being and lives. So I think we need to look to the past because we can see from the past before the kind of industrial revolution, there are lots of solutions that were more sustainable because they had to be, but that means there are insights there. But I think it's also really important to remember there are good things happening even now. And some of those good things are informed with contemporary technologies, IT and so on, and smart technologies. And some of those things are informed by indigenous technologies that have been going for a very, very long time as well. Tommy mentions that we need to throw the kitchen sink. We need to learn from all of the possible ideas that we can possibly learn from. We need to learn from each other. Lara talked about examples from the Middle East, for example. There are lots of examples from all over the world, especially indigenous wisdoms and technologies that we can also learn from to create a built environment that sort of goes at the same pace as nature rather than sort of trying to accelerate past it. And then it does not end in a happy ending, if we take it that way.
Thank you, Smith. Beautifully put. So, Tom, Smith has been talking there about the good things that are happening now, and also this issue around the use of resources. Any solution is going to require more resources. So that's the past covered by Lara and Smith there. Tom, if I could go to you now and ask, what solutions do we have now? And is technology our sole salvation, or are there other things? Or should we be thinking more holistically? Tom, I'm going to go to you first with this question.
We have a lot of solutions, and I think there's a really important point here that actually we have most of the solutions we need already if we only were brave enough collectively to use those rather than look for some kind of magical technical solution that's going to mean we don't have to change anything. I think really I'm talking about our leaders, I'm talking about politicians, and I'm talking about society at large accepting that some of those changes need to happen and following them through willingly because actually they will lead us all to a better place. But at the moment, there's a real desire, and particularly from governments around the world, to try and maintain business as usual and not have to make some of those changes because they'll lead to big upheaval. But we are heading back to a time of scarcity. And we were talking about the past there, a lot of those designs that we were talking about in the past that worked were driven by scarcity and by the fact that there weren't really any choices, as Smith said. There are real boundaries on how much low carbon electricity we'll be able to produce, at least in the near future. There are real boundaries on how much steel and concrete and timber we can use. So passive design is our friend here, where we can design buildings to use minimal amounts of energy and still achieve a good livable environment. And that means orientating them correctly. It means choosing what color they are, how much light we let in, shading. It means insulating them properly. All of those are things that use no energy once they're in place.
Can you explain the difference for us between a passive solution and an active solution, please?
So a passive solution is all about the fabric of the building, the fabric of the built environment itself and its inherent properties. So a well-insulated building. And, you can go to Scotland and see some buildings built in some really quite climatically exposed areas, and they've got very thick stone walls, which is before we had high-quality insulation or high-performance insulation that we could be using. But they're exactly, the thick walls and the small windows are there to control that energy gain and energy loss, and that works. There's some really good research now about how passive solutions work, and actually that painting our roofs white so that they're reflective and with height. And again, this combined with modern technology and really reflective paints is really effective at cooling buildings down.
A fun way I like to remember it is that a passive solution will work in a power cut.
Nice.
Much better way of describing it.
That's a good rule of thumb.
Of course, that assumes that you're not piped into a fossil fuel network like the gas network, of course, because then some things will continue to work in a power cut. But assuming you were cut off from your infrastructure, if it's still working, it's probably a passive solution, which is also very resilient.
So come a zombie apocalypse, you want to head straight for a passive house. Would that be about the size of it?
Please. See, we've got to think of the co-benefits here. It's not just about climate change. It's also about the zombies.
Yep.
There's an equity piece to all of this as well, which is that we in countries like the UK are pretty wealthy. We can afford to bring technological solutions in, and we can afford to make things work when maybe the right solution is to go with something more carefully designed or carefully thought about that doesn't use as many resources. But many countries in the world which are far more significantly affected by climate change can't. They don't have the money. We need to be taking on solutions which don't use more than we need to and are highly efficient in terms of their resources.
And on that subject of, because Smith, you were saying that retrofitting is more viable than new build. Is that a fair summary of what you were saying earlier?
Well, a new building is going to take a lot more resources to create. So we have to think of the whole life cycle, all of the kind of the emissions, the energy use, the resource use that goes into creating a home or a school or whatever that may be. And if you've already got a building, even if that building isn't sort of currently in its existing state, even if it's not currently good enough and you need to take measures in order to make it more energy efficient or cooler, it's still going to be very unlikely that that's not going to be a better decision than knocking it down and building a new one because of all of the resources that have gone into that existing building already.
Yeah.
Coming in there, I think it's really interesting that retrofitting is really important, but we come across a lot of projects where there's a real desire to knock buildings down and build new ones, driven by a whole range of perfectly valid reasons, like floor to ceiling heights could be higher. They just don't suit modern expectations of what a flat layout should be, and all sorts of other examples, often because in terms of financial viability, they won't sell for a high enough price and you need to sell it at a higher price. And this is going back to what I was saying before about being brave and about making the right decisions. There are some places here where we need to start changing our expectations and changing the criteria and the incentives we have around what we do with our built environment. And at the moment, they're too much stacked towards new build and not enough towards actually taking the housing stock we've got now and making it suitable for this climate future we're facing.
Thank you, Tom. Because I was looking at the Theatre Green Book, which I imagine you're all familiar with. It's something that Bureau Happel's been working on. They've been applying it to museums recently, which are often famously drafty buildings with specific atmospheric needs of exhibits. Even there, with a bit of judicious retrofitting, there are carbon savings to be had. Even I can see as a layman that there is a strong argument for retrofitting. Now, Lara, I would like to go to you. I want to get granular now. I know that's the word that I'm hearing a lot at the moment, so I'm going to use it to try and sound fashionable. Granular. I want to talk about district heat and cooling networks and ambient loops. And I think you've been doing a bit of work around that sort of thing, Lara. So yeah, could you tell us a little bit about those, please?
Yeah, sure. So a bit would be a bit of an understatement. I think there's a lot of investment that comes from the government into heat networks at the minute in the UK, especially in Scotland. So a district heat network is a network of pipes that might run underground, similar to how the gas network runs underground. And they connect up buildings together. So you might have an energy centre, which would be like a plant room or a small building with some heat generating plant that is in one location. And the district heat network, the pipes would run under the street and connect up buildings all into one network. A cooling network is a similar thing with cold water or chilled water in the pipes. And an ambient loop is something slightly different. So an ambient loop can do both heating and cooling. An ambient loop connects the buildings with larger diameter pipework with kind of tepid, ambient-ish temperature water. So somewhere between 10 to 20 degrees typically you're looking at. And what that means is that each building can tap into that ambient loop, so that tepid water in the pipes, with its own smaller water source heat pump. And what that means is that you can have one building that is taking heat from the network and heating that building. And at the same time, you can have another building on the same network that is rejecting heat into the network. So taking heat out of the building, i.e. cooling it, and putting that rejected heat into the network. And in places where you have a diversity of uses, for example, in city centres where you might have offices next to hotels, next to residential buildings, being able to simultaneously heat and cool and recover the heat from those different processes all back into the same network can be a really efficient thing to do. In addition to that, because you're operating at this nice kind of ambient-ish, tepid temperature, it's a really good way of recovering heat from maybe other sources, not just cooling of buildings, but maybe wastewater treatment plants, data centers, any other kind of low-grade heat sources that you might find quite often in urban environments.
It's absolutely fascinating. And currently, how many are there? What's the future of the heating and cooling network?
So typically we say that maybe Denmark and the Netherlands are miles ahead of us in terms of heat networks and ambient loops than the UK. The UK does have existing heat networks and more coming online as we speak. It's a rapidly growing sector. One that we worked on recently, so we think that this might be one of the first ambient loops in the UK, is the AMIDS site in Glasgow, which is a science and innovation park where we're recovering waste heat from a wastewater treatment plant onto an ambient network and distributing that across the science park, where we have different manufacturing and office buildings that are rejecting and taking heat from that ambient loop. You're wanting to extend heat networks in the UK and make sure that you can go from having smaller city centre networks into more bigger city scale networks and potentially beyond. And if you have a really large heat network, you can recover heat into that, maybe from a vent shaft from the tube or from a data center somewhere else or from a really large pumping station on the sewer network. And then because you're recovering the heat into the network at one location, if it's a really large network, you can export your heat in that way to somewhere that's quite remote.
I would say that the longer the heat has to travel, it's unlikely to retain its heat, I would say, for a very long distance.
That's such a good point.
So I'm not sure what kind of scale you're dreaming of here, Andy, but
Yeah. I was thinking, I don't know, Swindon to Malmesbury. That's the kind of scale I'm on these days. So yeah, I'm thinking big. But you know, you've got to float these ideas once in a while. And Lara, something else which we've talked about before is ESCOs, the energy service companies, billing warm hours. And that was something that you talked about, which really rather intrigued me. And could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so typically what people might see on their energy bill is, well, lots of different things that not a lot of people really understand. So you might be billed in pence per kilowatt hour. So you're paying a price for every kilowatt hour of energy that you're consuming. This idea of billing people based on warm hours or delivering heat as a service is a way of billing people so that they might pay for one, hopefully not one warm hour, hopefully a few warm hours a day, so that their house is kept at a certain temperature for that set amount of hours and they pay for that. And they might be able to pay an additional amount as well if they want to crank up the heat and have more warm hours, maybe on certain days, maybe where they're entertaining or for whatever reason. So in that way, an energy services company, on the one hand, the customer can understand their bill a lot better because a customer doesn't want a kilowatt hour of gas or a kilowatt hour of electricity. They want to feel warm. So they're being billed on what they understand. But also having this idea of a kind of end-to-end heat as a service also means that people like the energy services company can then pick up more responsibility and be more responsible for things like the maintenance of the whole heating system. So if the customer is paying for a certain amount of warm hours and is paying to keep their house at above a certain temperature for however long, and the energy services company is unable to do so, then it means it places an obligation then on the energy services company to go in and work out, well, what is the issue? Can we fix it? And come up with solutions to that. So it's a quite nice way of changing the way in which customers are billed that also has benefits for the customer.
Thank you very much. No, that's a fascinating idea, not one I heard of before.
And I think those kind of ideas are really interesting because, in that case, suddenly you've got something where there's a huge incentive for your energy provider to come and support homeowners and landlords and residents to actually upgrade the insulation in the houses to do the retrofitting. So one of these big problems we've got in the UK is that this all has to be a top-down process at the moment to really make this happen. And maybe those tweaks to how you do things could make this mean that there's much more of incentive for those kind of things to happen. But it also opens the door to concepts like people having a right to a livable temperature in their home, in the same way that your water utility can't just disconnect your water, and that actually there is a globally acknowledged right to water. There isn't really a globally acknowledged right to a decent temperature, but with the climate crisis we're heading into, where people are going to be facing unlivable temperatures in parts of the world, we in the UK are going to be facing very uncomfortable temperatures, and sometimes that may veer into unlivable territory. That actually we could be saying there actually everyone has that right to a home which provides them with that right temperature, actually have the systems around to get that to be viable. Those kind of ideas are things we need to be looking at more.
What can we do as individuals ourselves? What can we be doing to help mitigate this, the little wins that we can do that might contribute towards a bigger communal thing? Smith, if I could go to you first, what can little old me be doing?
I think in some ways these like heat as a service models, it's a kind of like Netflixification of heating, right? It's like you're paying for streaming service and you've got a clear billing that you understand and it's more related to what you know, but then you can always expect to go and watch your TV show or have the radiators on. But it also, there's another side to it that I think can put us at a bit of a distance from our own responsibilities as well to make sensible decisions. Do we really want to be running the dishwasher and the washing machine and 3 kettles when it's really not windy and really not sunny? Obviously, that's not sensible in a world where we have a limited renewable energy budget and we can't have everything on at once in the same way. I think sometimes the kind of on-demand service mentality leads us to expect that we can just have everything whenever we want to have everything and kind of disconnect us from the reality of, in the same way as you check the weather or you look outside the window before you decide what you're going to put on before you go outside, like in terms of what you're going to wear, maybe we need to just be thinking a little bit more about the weather and our energy use. It's like, It's raining and it's not at all sunny. So I'm going to take my umbrella and also I'm not going to, put 3 kettles on and boil loads of noodles right now. I'm not into like massive noodles right now.
Yeah, you really like noodles.
I do. It's true. And maybe I'm hungry, but I think it's just making those decisions like in relation to what's actually happening and not just expecting to be able to have everything all the time. And I don't mean that to sound like, we should be overly kind of strict about that and like, no, you cannot have this and that I say so. I think there are good examples of where energy companies have just very simply, sent texts out saying, we don't have much energy right now. If you can turn anything off, please do. And people will do that. It works really well when they've done these trials because people will do that just because everyone gets that. Like you don't have to necessarily make it about pricing or anything like overly complicated. Sometimes just transparent communication, like any good relationship, is enough to make a difference. And I think maybe for those on-demand things to work, they need to be paired with this kind of communication and mutual trust and like building up the trust in the infrastructure and in the systems that we're all relying on. So maybe in some ways I'm answering your question by saying like, well, what is it that we can do? Well, I think we just need to understand a little bit more about all of the processes that are at play. And obviously anybody who's still listening at this point in the podcast is committed to doing that. So thank you. But also just being open to changing little parts of our behaviors because those two little things can add up as well. And I think as we move from an energy system that is like using a lot of fossil fuels to an energy system that is much more reliant on things like the weather and how much storage we've got and things like that, then those peaks are much more difficult to service. So we need to collaborate a little bit to sort of smooth out our energy use. And so we have to do that through communication.
Brilliant. Thank you, Smith. That's a fascinating answer. And Lara, what are your thoughts on the individual? What power does the individual have?
I'd echo Smith's point around energy literacy. And that also goes to having an understanding of building physics and how you operate your own building. So that might be your own home. So being able to understand, can I make use of cross ventilation or do I have sash windows where I can make an opening at the top, bottom and at the top to increase the flow rate of air through my building? To be able to get comfortable with your energy bill and get comfortable with any energy data you have. We've got the smart meter rollout still happening in the UK, but through having smart meters in your home, you can access that data. So being able to access your data and look at how much energy am I using throughout the day? Can I see when I'm having a shower, when I'm using my kettle? Do I know what my home's base load is? And can I turn things off and turn things on? I think that getting comfortable with building physics and also with energy is such an important thing to be able to understand how you can use it better and just make sure that you're using our shared resources in a much more efficient way.
Thank you, Lara. And Tom, anything to add to that?
Well, I think it's really easy to be quite fatalistic about this, particularly as an individual going, what could I possibly do that would change this? There's some truth to that in the sense that we need major changes in the way that our system works in terms of providing energy and moving away from oil and all of these big things that individuals can't really control need to be happening. But we are also the sum of all of our parts as a society. So just to echo Smith's point, collaboration is really important. We need people to avoid behaviors like trying to hoard things and go, well, as long as I've got what I need, I don't care about everybody else, which is something we're all a bit prone to. Panic, if you're worrying about a power cut, the important thing is we do work together and minimize energy together. Otherwise, everyone has the power cut. So we need to work in each other's mutual interest as much as possible. I encourage people, those people listening to this podcast, become more activists, become a champion for these behaviors and for these changes that we see and show them off. And if you're keen to do this, then talk to your MP. If you're less comfortable with that, talk to your family and neighbors, but push for the changes and make them something that people at large believe in. That requires champions and it requires people to argue that case. So keep doing that.
Thank you very much.
An example of this is how Mediterranean countries deal with heat. They have a siesta. They change the way that they organize their day. So rather than running a huge amount of air conditioning to keep working during the hottest part of the day, you actually just say, we won't work then. We'll change the hours in which we are active. And there are all sorts of ways in which changes to our routines and how we do things, which might feel like a big disruption because people don't like change, are actually a really positive way to deal with the climate change that we're seeing and don't require resource-intensive technological solutions. That can be changing the hours we're in the office. It can be absolutely allowing people to wear more sensible clothes for the heat, and a whole raft of other similar examples where if our first approach to this should be thinking about are there ways we can tweak or change habits rather than build something new or burn some more oil.
Thank you very much. Now, panel, at this point, I'm going to ask you with equal parts trepidation and hope to don your silver suits and climb into your time machines. Now, we're looking today at climate change, and we're going to explore two versions of the future. One is the worst case scenario where we sit, complain about the weather, and do nothing about it. How bad would it really get? And the other is the best case utopia in which all those best ideas and attitudes are implemented. And what do those two futures look like? And I think I'll go to Smith first.
I think everyone actually knows how bad things can get. I think some of us think about it, and some of us have nightmares about it, and some of us can't sleep because we think about it a lot. And I would definitely put myself in that camp. And others like maybe sort of know deep down, but maybe don't look at it too much because it is really very, very scary. And I think if we don't do anything about it, we will fundamentally be living on a planet that we don't recognize. And that's like horrific. If we have a planet that we don't recognize that has nature that doesn't, you can imagine that you've just been not only transported to the future, but to a completely different place. And imagine you're trying to work out, is the air breathable? Can I eat this plant? All of those basic things that you can imagine from sci-fi. This is the sort of the level of difference we might be talking about. And that is really very scary. I think we know that. And I think the fear of confronting that is also sometimes the thing that prevents us from taking action. Because if we start taking action and we start thinking about this all the time, it's also feel kind of awful because then you're thinking about it all the time. And that's my experience as well. It's like the more I got into worrying about climate change and sustainability and so on, then the more I was kind of having those thoughts. But the flip side of that is that also then if you are working to build kind of agreement and consensus and have visions for actually what a much better future would be than that, so no bar, that also feels really good. It feels really good because you're working together with people who really care about positive and good things and who care about people and who care about animals and nature. But I think the important thing about the hopeful version of the future is that we will collaborate, we will share, we'll be working together for our mutual interests, as Tom's saying. And actually all of those things that we could do to make that better future feel really good. They feel like you don't feel like you're at work. You feel like you're having a party because you're doing good things together. That's really hopeful and will lead us to a more hopeful future. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's definitely much better to feel like you're kind of moving towards something good rather than just ignoring something terrible.
Yeah, thank you, Smith. So absolutely, collaboration is key. Lara, what would you think when entering that time machine? What are your thoughts?
Like Smith, I am absolutely terrified of entering time machine where we do nothing. We're heading out for all out war and devastation. But what I find hopeful is the people that I meet who work in this industry and work around sustainability and energy and around climate change are a lot more hopeful than those that might have been educated about it but don't work on it. There are hundreds of thousands of us, millions. I don't even know how many climate jobs there are globally right now. And there's so many of us working for a better future. We're trying, there is investment in these solutions, but there needs to be more. And we're aiming for a future where people can meet their own needs without compromising the needs of others. So in that way, we're working towards something that's a lot more collaborative, a lot more cooperative, and is a lot more positive. So I am quite hopeful for the future, but we're working really, really hard to get there. I would send out a rallying cry to anyone who has an inkling of wanting to move into a climate job to do so.
That's a beautiful answer and a rallying cry. I like that. We need those people rallied, don't we? And Tom, what are your thoughts on this time travel paradox?
The time I spent as a working humanitarian aid is relevant because I've seen some of this future in some of the disasters I've been involved in responding to. Megastorms in the Philippines, which destroyed over 1 million homes in one go. Floods in India, which displaced huge numbers of people. And it results in total destitution and misery. And that's going to become more and more common and more widespread. And it might feel far away from here in the UK, but let's not forget we're an exposed island in the North Atlantic. So we're definitely not safe from the changes that are coming. And we're not very good at disaster management in this country. So the future is pretty bleak if we just let this run its course. We'll be facing a world of disasters and conflict, and it will become increasingly unlivable. In terms of the answer to that, Smith and Lara have covered it. A way in which the world could work together and respond. And if you get to the end of it, it actually makes me feel a little bit lighter about the future, a little bit more positive. It's not the way in which this will be done. It's a science fiction book looking into the future. But there are ways in which, if we work together, put aside differences and actually collaborate to make the big changes we need in the world, there are ways in which there's a much more positive future. And all of this could lead to us all being a lot happier in a world that's more equitable and doesn't overuse our resources and has more wildlife in it and more biodiversity. And it's just generally a much more pleasant place to be. But we do need to make those changes together. And at the moment, that's not happening, and it's not happening fast enough.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Tom. So there we have it. Whether the weather be hot or whether the weather be cold, we need to be acting now, whatever the weather. As we are learning in Sandbox, there is always hope, but it has never been clearer that Earth's future, our future, is dependent on the critical decisions, be it infrastructural, behavioural, political, educational, communal or individual, we take right now. As our panel are saying, there is hope. So many of us are collaborating for a better future, but now we all need to heed the rallying cry. We want you to join the conversation. Just use the hashtag #BHSandbox on X, the artist formerly known as Twitter. Don't forget to subscribe to follow the show. You'll find Sandbox in all the usual places. And now all that's left for me to do is to thank our panel from this month very much indeed. That's Smith Mordak, as well as Bureau Happold's Lara Balash and Tom Newby. And thanks to you for listening. Goodbye for now, dear listener.